Today, we become legends.
A few days ago, I posted to my community asking which brand new gods they want to see in Smite 2. Using that post and some sleuthing of Smite Twitter and Smite Reddit, I created a survey with the most common responses to that question and sent it out to both my audience and the Smite Reddit to gather data on which gods the community wants most for Smite 2. Of course, there are literally thousands of potential gods, myths, and legends that could be added to Smite 2, and there may be some that you personally like that weren't in the survey. But I simply couldn't cover every god, and I only chose the most popular and common responses I often see. There were 38 potential picks in the survey, and I asked over 1,000 respondents to rank them all from 1 to 5 based on how much they want them in Smite 2. I then averaged out all the scores, and we'll discuss them in this video, from least wanted to most wanted, so let's jump in. So first and least, we have the 2 SCP cryptids that I threw into the survey just for fun to see where they landed. Again, these are modern creepypastas and not really something they would ever consider adding to Smite, and probably shouldn't, but I thought it would be interesting to at least add them to the survey anyway and see how they performed. Abysmally was the answer. Next up, and a big jump up from the SCPs, we have Sir Percival from Arthurian legend. He's mostly known for his childlike innocence that somewhat protected him from corruption and worldly temptations, and was one of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. He's a more minor figure in Arthurian legend and not super distinct, so it's understandable that he placed this low. If they were to add more Knights of the Round Table, there are probably better options than Percival. Polyphemus is up next, who is a one-eyed giant in Greek mythology and the son of Poseidon. He's most known for trapping Odysseus and his party of 12 inside a cave and devouring them one by one until Odysseus got the giant so drunk that he passed out, then blinded him with a burning stake through his one eye, allowing Odysseus and what remained of his party to escape and continue their odyssey. Personally, I really like Polyphemus, and I think he's a fairly unique face that could work well in Smite, but he is a much more minor character in Greek mythos, so it's understandable that he placed fairly low here. Next up is a silly one that I put on the survey just for fun and curiosity's sake, that being Jesus Christ. They would never add him anyway, but he ended up placing pretty low regardless. He did have one of the funniest response curves of any entry on the list though, with an insane amount of both 5s and 1s. But the 1s won out for the most part, and he did end up placing very low. Next up is Freyr, not to be confused with his sister Freya. Freyr is the male Norse god of fertility, peace, good weather, and harvest. He famously had to give up his legendary sword that fights on its own and best a Jotun using only an antler. He did this to win the favor of a female Jotun that he fell in love with. However, when Ragnarok comes, Freyr will be slain by Surtur due to the lack of his legendary sword. I think there's definitely some interesting elements here, such as Freyr's relationship with Freya and his magical sword that fights on its own. Could have some really interesting gameplay elements built around it, I think. Another Norse god is up next, who is Sigurd, who is well known in Germanic myth as well, and is mostly famous for slaying Fafnir with the legendary blade Gram. It was said that Fafnir's brother, Regin, manipulated Sigurd into slaying Fafnir so that he could claim the dragon's hoard for himself. Afterwards, Sigurd bathed in the blood of Fafnir, which made him invulnerable everywhere except a small part of his back where a leaf had fallen, sharing strong parallels with Achilles. There's definitely some interesting stuff to explore with Sigurd, such as his interactions with Fafnir and his legendary sword, but overall, I can see why he placed fairly low. He's ultimately a fairly generic hero type guy. Next up, we have Beowulf, who I saw requested quite a lot by people on my community post and on Reddit and Twitter, but ultimately he scored fairly low. Of course, this one is a little controversial in itself due to him not being a god. He shares some similarities with Sigurd actually in that regard, being a Norse and Germanic hero who's a great warrior, slays several monsters terrorizing Norway and Sweden, then fights a dragon, the difference being that Beowulf is slain by the dragon. It's of course not completely out of the realm of possibility that a normal human with somewhat godlike renown could make it into Smite. King Arthur is basically this, but ultimately Beowulf placed fairly low on this list. Saturn is up next, who is the Roman counterpart to Cronus, as in the Titan, not the god of time Kronos that we have in Smite. So it's not out of the question that Saturn could be added. It's highly unlikely that Roman equivalents of Greek gods we already have would be added outside of maybe a skin and vice versa, but Cronus and therefore Saturn are quite different to Kronos. Anyway, Saturn is associated with time, abundance, wealth, and agriculture, and it's said that his reign was depicted as a golden age of peace and abundance. Saturn is somewhat interesting, but ultimately there are more unique and cool gods that could come before him in my opinion, so I can see why he placed fairly low. Shamash is up next from Babylonian and Mesopotamian mythology. You might know his name from Gilgamesh's ultimate, the Winds of Shamash. He's the god of the sun, and together with Sin, the moon god, and Ishtar, he forms part of the core triad of divinities in Mesopotamian mythology. Like many many sun gods, Shamash is responsible for bringing the light and warmth to the world and allowing crops to grow. He is also associated with being the grand judge of both gods and humans and has other justice themes. Shamash is kind of cool and has some unique elements, but ultimately is just another sun god that will probably share a lot of design space with others like Ra, so I can see why he plays fairly low. Oshun from Yoruba myth is next up and is depicted as the protector, savior, and nurturer of humanity, as well as the maintainer of spiritual balance. She is also often associated with the creation of humanity, much like other gods such as Nuwa or Yuang in Chinese mythology. Oshun is one of the 17 Orishas that were sent to Earth by the supreme deity Olorun. Oshun is pretty cool in my opinion overall, but does share a lot of qualities with Yamoja and is sometimes even conflated with her. They aren't the same. In fact, it's usually said that Oshun is the daughter or sister of Yamoja, but they do share a lot of similar themes like water, motherhood, fertility, and protection of mankind, so I'm not sure she would make a super good fit for the roster given those similarities. Next up is Guinevere, the wife of King Arthur and secret lover of Lancelot in Arthurian myth. As the wife of Arthur, she was also the reigning queen of Britannia for a time. Her role varies depending on the literature and depiction chosen, and she is sometimes a loyal protector of Arthur to the end, and other times betrays him and is portrayed more as a lustful traitor and seducer, especially in her affair with Lancelot. You could go in multiple directions with Guinevere depending on how much you wanted to take from each depiction, but ultimately she is just a normal human queen for the most part. King Arthur possesses Excalibur, Morgana and Merlin have their magics, and even Lancelot has blessings from Nimue and is a world-renowned knight. I'm not sure how exactly they could make Guinevere interesting enough to justify bringing her, but she would have at least some cool lore interactions with the other Arthurians, so there's that. Kratos is up next, not to be confused with Kratos from the God of War, as he is not based on the real Kratos, they're completely different characters. The real Kratos is the personification of strength and power and is one of the Greek titans alongside figures like Atlas. To be honest, the actual mythological Kratos is far less interesting than the God of War version of Kratos, and not that much is even known about him. And since the team said they wouldn't ever do crossover gods due to licensing issues, they will be limited to only the Greek titan Kratos, which would be fairly uninteresting as a fit for the game in my opinion, as he's just another rage-fueled embodiment of strength and powerful warrior. We have enough of those already, so I can somewhat see why this guy plays fairly low. Next up is Indra, who you may know from Indra's Scepter that drops from the comets in Year 11 Smite and from the Obelisk in Season 9 Smite. Indra is the Hindu god of thunder, rain, storms, and weather in general. In that regard, he does share a lot of design space with Chak and other deities such as Raijin, Thor, and Zeus. They could absolutely make something unique out of Indra. Hell, just take a look at how many of the storm, thunder, and rain gods we have already that are fairly unique, but I would rather see something more unique personally added to the game. So Galahad is up next, who is another of King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table and one of the more famous ones alongside Lancelot. Galahad is essentially the embodiment of chivalry, gallantry, and purity. Basically, he's the perfect medieval knight, which is somewhat ironic considering his birth was the result of a deceptive affair between Lancelot and Lady Elaine, who disguised herself as Guinevere. Galahad's most famous story is his quest for the Holy Grail, which he somewhat shares with Percival from earlier. Galahad would be a cool addition in my opinion, but much like some previous entries, it might be hard to differentiate him from others such as Lancelot and King Arthur, as he is ultimately just another knight dude. They could do it for sure, but he would share a lot of design space with existing members of the roster, and I would personally rather see more unique figures from Arthurian legend that we'll get to later in the list. Ku is next up, who you may know from the Totem of Ku and is a god of war in Polynesian mythology. Not much is written about Ku to be honest, but he does have a cool flaming mace that contains and draws powers from the souls of those he's killed. Honestly, Ku is fairly uninteresting to me, and I feel like maybe he placed higher just through familiarity from the totem. Dracula is up next, who is a pretty polarizing entry, but certainly placed higher than some others in that category like the SCPs and Jesus. This is one of those pop culture myths and legends that I could honestly see making it into the game. You all know Dracula presumably, and aside from Camazots, we don't really have a vampire-like character in the game, and I think it could explore a lot of interesting gameplay and visual areas with Dracula. It is pushing the boundaries a little bit, but I think he would fit quite well, and a lot of Smite's best designs have come from pushing the boundaries and going beyond specific gods from ancient religions. For example, King Arthur and Cthulhu. I would love to see Dracula personally, but I can understand why a lot of people would vote him as a 1, as he does really stretch the gods, myths, and legends label of Smite to a fairly high degree. Next up though, we're back to some normal mythological gods, as we have Amit, who is an Egyptian goddess often depicted as a hybrid of a lion, a hippo, and a crocodile, but sometimes just depicted as a straight up giant crocodile. She is the personification of divine retribution and is most known for sitting in on Anubis' judgments of mortals as they depart to the afterlife. Anubis would weigh the heart of the mortal against Maat's feather and truth, and if the heart was heavier than the feather, the mortal had regrets and secrets weighing them down in life and will be devoured by Amit. Otherwise, they will be sent to the heavenly beyond. Amit is pretty cool overall, but might be slightly harder to work with as not much is really known about her other than this called judgment myth. There's also only so far you can go with a giant crocodile that eats the hearts of mortals, though I'm sure they could make it work. They've made make great designs out of less before. Next up, we have the Green Knight from Arthurian legend, who is one of those slightly more interesting characters that would be a better addition than Percival or Galahad, in my opinion. The Green Knight's most famous story is that he showed up to Camelot's court and challenged any knight present to a free blow on him that would be returned in a year and a day from then. Gawain took up the challenge, thinking he could simply slay the Green Knight in one blow and never have to suffer the consequences. Gawain did decapitate the Green Knight in a single blow, however, he remained alive and promised to return in a year and a day and deliver his own strike on Gawain. The Green Knight is a very mysterious figure that obviously has some kind of magical properties associated with him, and his unique visual design as well will differentiate him from being just another Arthurian knight, which is why I think he might be a better fit than someone like Galahad, Percival, or Gawain. Odysseus is up next, who you probably know from his namesake item in Smite, Odysseus Bow. He is also named for the Odyssey, basically the legendary quest that he undertook that was a central component of Homer's The Odyssey, one of the most famous Greek mythological texts of all time. Odysseus is most famous for his role in the Trojan War, where he performed many feats such as besting great generals in single combat, being the mastermind behind the Trojan horse plan to infiltrate Troy, as well as retrieving Achilles, who it was prophesied would win the war for Greece. Odysseus would be a really cool addition in my opinion, and there's so much written about him that you could pull from, so you could easily find ways to make him very unique among the roster, I think. Balder is up next, who's another banger in my opinion that I'm surprised isn't already in Smite, given he's one of the most recognizable Norse gods. Famously immune from harm with the only weakness of mistletoe, he does share some design space with Achilles in that regard. It is said that Balder's death will be the event that brings about Ragnarok, and Loki, being, you know, Loki, tricks a blind god into throwing mistletoe at Balder, which kills him and brings about Ragnarok. Much like Odysseus, Balder is very well known and a lot is written about him. I think he'd be an amazing fit for the roster. Vishnu is up next, which is a somewhat interesting one, as we do already have two avatars of Vishnu in the form of Rama and Vamana. Vishnu is one of the three supreme deities in Hinduism alongside Brahma and Shiva, and he is said to be the protector and preserver of the universe, returning to Earth in the form of his avatars who uphold Hindu religious law. With him being the supreme deity of the largest sect of Hinduism, there's a lot written about Vishnu, and I think he would make a great fit for the roster. However, I'm not sure exactly what complications would arise from having Vishnu and his avatars in the game at once. Someone more knowledgeable on Hinduism might be able to enlighten me on that one in the comments below. Mani is up next, who is the brother of Sol and the Norse personification of the moon. Sol and Mani both drag the sun and moon across the sky respectively, being eternally chased by Skoll and Hati, two of Fenrir's sons. This is how Norse mythology explains the movement of the sun and moon and day-night cycles. Not that much is written about Mani other than that he is calm, collected, and reserved compared to Sol's fiery, passionate, and loud personality. But they managed to make Sol work with fairly little written about her. They could do the same for Mani, I'm sure. And there could even be some cool lore interactions between the two and Fenrir. Not my absolute most wanted god or anything, but Mani would be a cool addition. Next up, we have the first of three great old ones that I put in this survey, all of which plays pretty high. Yog-Sothoth is one of the outer gods in Lovecraftian mythos. Basically, they are the most powerful beings in all of existence, with Cthulhu not even registering on the scale compared to an outer god. He generally manifests as a mass of glowing orbs with eyes and tendrils, but of course the team could take some creative liberties to give him a more tangible form like they did with Cthulhu. Yog-Sothoth is mostly depicted as somewhat of a master of time and space, as well as the guardian and gatekeeper of the entrance to the outer realms, though he is often depicted as so detached from humanity's perception of reality that we can't even conceive of him. Of all the great old ones that could be added, Yog-Sothoth is probably one of my lesser wanted ones, but he's still very interesting, and honestly any new addition to this pantheon will be awesome in my opinion, and it seems like the community agrees, given Cthulhu was the most popular release of all time, and all three great old ones ranked very highly on this survey. Next up though, we're back to traditional mythology with Nidhogg, the Norse serpentine dragon who continually gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil in an attempt to topple it. Nidhogg has appeared in Smite already as a skin for Jormungandr and a boss in the Odin's Onslaught mode, but that doesn't necessarily mean he can't ever be added as a playable god, as we have seen skins for King Arthur and Mordred long before they ever released as playable gods. Honestly, to me, Nidhogg is cool, but not that interesting, and there are definitely others I'd rather see, though it would be nice to get a new monster addition to the roster at the very least. Next up, we have Prometheus from Greek mythology, who is most known for stealing fire from the Olympian gods and giving it to humanity, kickstarting our progress towards becoming the dominant species of Earth. Zeus's punishment was dealt out in the form of an eternity of Prometheus being tied to a rock and an eagle eating his liver, only to have it regenerate the next day and be eaten again. In ancient Greece, the liver was thought to be the emotional center of a person, so essentially Prometheus experienced never-ending emotional pain for his transgressions against the Olympian gods. Prometheus is cool and all, but I was kind of surprised he placed this high. I don't think he's that interesting. Next up, we have Hypnos, who is the Greek god of sleep and dreams, the twin brother of Thanatos and son of Nyx and Erebus. He is often depicted with various adornments like a horn filled with sleep-inducing drugs and a staff with the stem of a poppy attached that induces sleep in its targets. deities. He was prayed to by the sick and dying in hopes that he would put them into an end of sleep and ease their passing. Hypnos is pretty cool in my opinion, and there could definitely be some interesting design space to explore on the sleep side of things. Maybe an enchanter support focused around mesmerizers as his main game plan or something like that. Definitely would be a cool addition to the roster, I think. Next up, we have Skull and Hearty, who I've mentioned before as being two of Fenrir's sons that eternally chase Sol and Mani across the sky. I won't go into too much detail on them for that reason, but these could be a cool addition, maybe as either a double release with somewhat mirrored kits, or even as some sort of double god that requires 2 players to select and play them. That's probably too wild for Smite, but it could be cool in my opinion. Next up is probably the god I see suggested the most, and that's Lu Bu, a renowned and legendary warrior in Chinese myth that is known for his unstable personality and tendency to betray his allies on a whim. He's sort of like a more chaotic counterpart to Guan Yu in that way, and I think they could definitely have some cool interactions in game. Would be a really cool addition in my view. Next up is Demeter, who is a personal favorite of mine. She's the Greek goddess of agriculture, the harvest, and fertility, and mother of Persephone. Her most famous tale is that when Persephone was abducted by Hades and forced to eat pomegranate seeds which bind the eater to the underworld, Demeter was so distraught that the sun dimmed in the sky and no crops could grow, causing mass famine throughout the world. When Zeus brokered a deal with Hades allowing Persephone to return to Mount Olympus for 6 months of the year, Demeter was overjoyed and the sun shone bright and the harvests were bountiful. But when the time came for Persephone to return to the underworld, for those 6 months the sun once again dimmed and the crops withered and died. This is how ancient Greece explains the seasons, which is pretty cool in my opinion, and I would love to see Demeter added at some point. Next up is another popular female Greek deity, Hestia. She is the goddess of hearth, home, and family, and one of the 12 Olympians. Mortals make offerings and prayers to Hestia to protect their homes and keep their hearths lit, as well as bless them with ample food and drink. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is a fairly unique role in mythology, at least within Smite, and I think Hestia could explore some very interesting design space, as she's not really a warrior or fighter in any sense, and could probably be a very interesting kit design based on that. Most likely a support, maybe based around food, given her theming. Next up, we have Sekhmet, who is another one of my personal favorites that I would love to see added, and I think she could fill a very nice gameplay niche as well as just being a cool god overall. Sekhmet is the Egyptian goddess of war, destruction, and strength, but is also associated with healing and medicine. Hence her item in Smite 1 that is a damage item with a secondary healing focus. And that's the niche I think she could fill quite well within Smite 2. An aggressive, assassin-like design that also has a secondary focus on healing and team support. We have plenty of mages, guardians, and warriors with a healing focus, and we even have Cupid and Chiron with minor healing, but no real assassins that focus on team healing, so that would be a cool niche to fill, and Sekhmet will be perfect for that role. Next up, we're back to the great old ones with Azathoth, who is basically the supreme deity and most powerful being of all Lovecraftian mythos. I said that Cthulhu doesn't even register on the scale compared to Yog-Sothoth. Well, Azathoth is significantly more powerful and dangerous than even Yog-Sothoth is. That's how powerful and all-consuming this guy is. He is said to be beyond description and comprehension, and a mortal even catching a small glimpse of Azathoth would cause their complete and utter destruction. This might be a little hard to work around in terms of creating an actual visual representation of Azathoth in-game, but I'm sure they could make it work. As I've said before, any new addition to this pantheon would be dope, and Azathoth is one of my more hoped for great old ones. Next up, we have Erishkigal, who I didn't know too much about beyond surface level stuff before researching her for this survey, but after doing some digging, I think she'd be an amazing fit for the roster. Erishkigal is essentially the goddess of death and the underworld in Babylonian and Mesopotamian mythology. She keeps the dead from leaving the underworld and keeps the living from entering it, as well as preventing the living from learning the true nature of the afterlife. One of Ishtar's death quotes references her in-game.
Release me, Ereshkigal.
Erishkigal has some cool iconography and symbols associated with her, such as the number 7, her Eye of Death that symbolizes her mastery over life and fate, as well as owls and lions representing power and leadership. While she does inevitably share some theming with other death and underworld deities such as Hades, I think Erishkigal would be a very cool and unique addition to the roster. Next up, we have one of my personal most wanted additions with Nimue, aka the Lady of the Lake from Arthurian legend. This is one of those other more unique characters from these myths that I would rather see compared to just a fairly generic Arthurian knight. The Lady of the Lake's roles and actions vary based on the depiction, but she is most known for raising Lancelot from infancy to become the greatest and most honorable knight the world has ever seen, as well as blessing him with protection and tasking him with protecting King Arthur from any threat. The lake she guards is also said to hold the portal that serves as the entrance to Avalon, basically the Arthurian heaven world. I think Nimue would serve as a perfect support addition to the Arthurian roster, and is far more unique than the likes of Galahad, Percival, or Gawain in my opinion. Next up, and actually breaking the top 5 for the list is another I quite like, and that's Typhon from Greek mythology. You probably know his name from the item Typhon's Fang, and I think he would be my go-to monster edition were we to get one. Typhon is usually depicted as a serpentine dragon-like monster with a vast array of snake-headed limbs, and it's said to be the father of all monsters in Greek myth, with Echidna being the mother. Typhon famously fought a long cataclysmic battle with Zeus for control of the cosmos and lost, with Zeus banishing Typhon to Tartarus for all eternity. With our last monster edition being such a disappointment, Typhon could redeem that, and I think it'd be a great addition. Next up is yet another of my personal favorites, and that's Enkidu. Famously the rival turned friend of Gilgamesh as depicted in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu is often described as the temper to the blade that is Gilga, smoothing out the rough edges of his personality through his wisdom and teaching him to become a better and more fair ruler. When Ishtar sends the bull of heaven at Gilgamesh, he kills it along with the help of Enkidu, and the gods punish him by killing Enkidu, which sets Gilgamesh on his quest for immortality. These two are just such an iconic duo that it almost feels wrong having Gilgamesh in the game without Enkidu, and they could have some really cool lore interactions similar to King Arthur and Merlin or Horus and Set, which would be dope in my opinion. Breaking into the top 3 highest scorers, we have Izanagi, brother to Izanami, who together created the Japanese archipelago by raising the land from the ocean. Izanagi is also the father of the legendary trio of Amaterasu, Susanoo, and Tsukuyomi. Izanagi's most famous tale is that of Izanami's descent into Yomi, the Japanese underworld, and subsequent corruption by it. Izanagi followed Izanami to Yomi, but when he found her, she had eaten the food there and become corrupted by it, which is why she is depicted the way she is in Smite. Izanagi fled in horror, pursued by Izanami and the others from Yomi. When he reached the entrance, he sealed it with a giant boulder so that Izanami could never be unleashed upon the world. Some really cool backstory there, and a bit like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, it almost feels wrong to have Izanami in the game but not have Izanagi. He'd be a really cool addition in my opinion. Next up though, we have the final great old one of the survey and the highest scorer of them, Nyarlathotep. Much like Yog-Sothoth and Azathoth, Nyarlathotep is an outer god who is incomprehensibly more powerful than Cthulhu. However, Nyarlathotep is a little different than the other outer gods in that he is able to freely walk the mortal plane and frequently visits the earth in disguise. Though many of his thousands of forms will cause humanity to immediately collapse in on itself from insanity, in his human disguise he can walk the earth freely, and is even the most human-like outer god by far in his use of deception and in his appearance. This will probably make him easier to depict in-game compared to something like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth, which is why he's my personal favorite that they could add from Lovecraftian mythos. I would love to see this guy personally make it into the game. And finally, the number 1 most requested god on the survey was Fujin? Honestly, I'm very surprised by this one. Fujin is the brother of Raijin in Japanese mythology and the god of wind and storms. He's cool and all, but I didn't expect him to make it to the very top of the list. So I'm curious, if you're watching this and took part in the survey, why did you rate Fujin so high? Granted, he only scored 0.005 points higher than number 2, but I fully expected this guy to have a middling placement for the most part, and was genuinely surprised when I saw the results and this guy being on top. Sure, we have Raijin, and having Fujin to make them a duo would be cool, but they're not as iconic as something like Gilgamesh and Enkidu or Izanami and Izanagi in my opinion. I don't know, I'm not trying to discount him completely, he is fairly cool, but I just didn't expect him to place even top 10, never mind top 1. Let me know down below if you took part why you rated Fujin so high. But that's it. Of course, this survey was far from all-encompassing, but I did try to include all the gods I saw somewhat mentioned frequently in various Reddit posts and my own YouTube community post, so this should at least be a decent representation of what the community thinks overall. Let me know your own personal most wanted god down below though, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.